Welcome to our May Acton Lecture Series. We're absolutely delighted that you're here. And those of you joining us on live stream, thank you for joining us from across the world for this lecture. It's really a delight to have you here to hear from a really interesting voice on the combination of economics and technology and political science. We have a really interesting engagement because next year is the 250th anniversary of the country, of course, but also of Adam Smith's printing of The Wealth of Nations. So there'll be a lot of events next year regarding the founding and some of the prime documents of liberal democracy. And so we thought we'd bring somebody today who I've been following for over 7 years. We invited Dr. Philip Bunn, he wasn't doctor then, 7 years ago to one of our smaller events in Austin, Texas on technology and the future of work. And he was one of the graduate students attending. But I've really enjoyed following his career as he's worked through his PhD and is now teaching. So let me read a short bio and we'll welcome him together. Dr. Bunn is Assistant Professor of Political Science at Covenant College in Lookout Mountain, Georgia, where he researches and writes on topics ranging from politics, technology, literature, and film. Prior to Covenant, he was visiting scholar in the Lyceum program at Clemson University for the Institute of Study of Capitalism and a lecturer at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Specializing in political theory and American politics, he's working on a book project called The Heart of the Machine, which we will get a preview during this lecture of what he is engaging. It examines threats to liberty identified by thinkers within the liberal tradition and expands their insights into the technological present. His research has been published in the Political Research Quarterly, American Political Thought, Political Science Reviewer, and Perspectives on Political Science, as well as his popular level writing in Current Magazine, the Intercollegiate Review, American Conservative, among many others. Please give a warm Acton welcome to Dr. Philip Bunn.
Thank you to Acton for having me out. Thank you to Dan for extending the kind invitation. Thank you all for being here today. I hope you find something interesting in this. I want to begin with a story that will help explain the title of my lecture and my book project. The story is an old one. It comes from the Chinese sage philosopher Chuang-Tzu, but I came to it by way of Werner Heisenberg in his book, The Physicist's Conception of Nature. And so in the course of this broader conversation about how technology has changed man's relationship to nature, Heisenberg recounts this parable, and it tells of a man traveling through the Chinese countryside by horse, and he sees a farmer laboriously drawing water from a well and carting it by hand to his irrigation ditch and dumping it out. And the work is slow, it's plodding, and it's inefficient. And the man offers the farmer a remedy to his menial toil in the form of a new productive technology. He tells the farmer of this thing called a draw well, and he describes the mechanism to him, a weighted arm on a sort of pulley that assists you in lifting the water from the well. And he says, hey, you could even have a trough that carries the water from the well to your irrigation ditch for you. And the man is shocked because the farmer responds not with gratitude, but with anger. And he responds, I've heard my teacher say that whoever uses machines does all his work like a machine. He who does his work like a machine grows a heart like a machine in his breast, and he who carries the heart of a machine in his breast loses his simplicity. And he who has lost his simplicity becomes uncertain in the strivings of his soul. And uncertainty in the strivings of one's soul is something which does not agree with honest sense. It's not that I do not know of such things, the farmer says. It's that I am ashamed to use them. So the farmer, I think, here is concerned not with efficiency, with productivity, or the type of freedom he would possess if he was freed from his drudgery. Instead, he's concerned with a loss of freedom within his own soul as a human being, to reason like a human being, to work in a way characteristic of a human being, different from a way a machine would teach him to think and to function. And so the farmer is, in this short parable, I think, presenting a kind of complex and interesting critique of technology that pushes pushes back against our intuition that technology is usually or sometimes always an aid to our freedom, that it's holistically beneficial. Instead, he says machines can mutilate the human psyche in some kind of way. I'm quoting this from Heisenberg instead of Chuang-Tzu directly because I think Heisenberg uses it to great effect. He says essentially, if anything could capture man's relationship to technology in his day, and I think in ours, it would be this phrase, uncertainty in the strivings of your soul. I think about that a lot. And so this set me sort of on a path of considering, when does technology make us less free? I think it's obvious on a kind of quick reflection that there are intuitive ways technology makes us more free. I have, for example, freedom of movement that I did not have before the invention of planes, trains, and automobiles. I have freedom of opportunity that my grandparents didn't have in terms of my access to information and careers. Technology has also, according to many people, provided avenues of political liberty. Think of the sort of perhaps overstated but famed role of Twitter in the Arab Spring uprisings, right? But it's also obvious, I think, on maybe even a briefer reflection, that technology can be and is used to directly oppress and constrain our liberty, to restrict, to surveil. So whether at the hands of states, government actors, foreign enemies, domestic intelligence apparatuses, the big brother-like uses of technology, or the hypothetical, heavy-handed behavioralist conditioning of Huxley's imagination, these are restrictions on freedom. We might think also of what has been called more recently surveillance capitalism, the use of these technologies to oppress by perhaps private actors, as people like Sohrab Ahmari have pointed out in his book Tyranny, Inc. But in line with Heisenberg's use of Chuang-Tzu's ancient parable, my question today is about other losses of freedom, not uses of technology directly to oppress or constrain. Rather, what if we lose our freedom not at the level of technology, not the level of policy, of oppression, of tyranny, but rather kind of at the level of our own psychology, in the strivings of our souls? What if there are ways our own choices become less than fully ours, that our faculties that make us free and independent human beings could be degraded, and that we could thus become less than fully human and less than fully free? And so those are the questions I want to wrestle with a little bit today. And I want to do so through the thoughts of some great writers who have come before me. There's a great quote from Cormac McCarthy's novel in dramatic form, The Sunset Limited, where the character Black says, the first thing you got to know about me is I don't have an original thought in my head. If something doesn't have the lingering scent of divinity on it, I want nothing to do with it. And that's how I feel about most of my work. I'm just telling you what other people have said. So time permitting, I want to take you on a quick tour of two thinkers that I found very useful for thinking about this topic of technology and liberty: Adam Smith and John Stuart Mill. I also do some stuff on Tocqueville if you want to ask me questions about that, but for time reasons I'm going to have to skip over Tocqueville, but I was told that I should mention that because this is a Tocqueville-loving audience. So I think these thinkers, Smith and Mill, are in an interesting conversation together. Mill as a reader of Smith, expanding on his ideas in his own work, both sitting on sort of opposite sides of the Industrial Revolution, one when it's budding, one in the full flower of it, and both having some, I think, interesting thoughts on the technology of their day. And then I will conclude by suggesting some ways I think these thinkers can help us think about technology in our day, in our technological present. So, Smith. Smith is quite famous, obviously, for his political economic thought captured in his second full and final book, The Wealth of Nations. But I want to begin by honing in on his first, lesser known but far better book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments. I'll call it TMS from now on for brevity's sake. As some of you may be aware, TMS is a book that occupied much of Smith's brain for most of his life. It went through many editions during the lifetime of the author, and unlike the textbooks I assigned to my students, these editions were substantive revisions, so it's worth reading the later editions rather than just picking up the old one. And in TMS, Smith argues that there is this human faculty that he calls sympathy, which enables us to be interested in the fortunes of others. And he says that human potential is best fulfilled through the progressive development of our faculties for sympathy, for moral reasoning and exercise of judgment, which allow us to associate freely and experience the joys of human sociability. So he opens the work with this iconic line, "How selfish soever man may be supposed, there are evidently some principles in his nature which interest him in the fortunes of others, and render their happiness necessary to him, though he derives nothing from it except the pleasure of seeing it." So people, according to Smith, naturally possess this ability to feel with or for other people in their happiness and their sadness, their pleasure and their pain. And this natural ability to feel with or for other people in both of those scenarios is what he calls sympathy. The subsequent arguments in TMS provide detailed accounts of how precisely people learn to moderate their passions sympathetically so as not to overwhelm the people around them, their spectators, with joy or grief in excess beyond their friend's ability to sympathize with it. It's our desire to feel with and similarly to others that leads us to learn what he calls the virtues of candid condescension and indulgent humanity, as well as self-denial, self-government, and command of the passions. In other words, we learn to be nice to other people and indulge in their feelings, and we tamp down our own feelings so that they aren't overwhelmed by our excessive joy or grief in the hopes that they'll do the same thing for us. So Smith further argues that to feel much for others and little for ourselves, to restrain our selfish and indulge our benevolent affections, constitutes the perfection of human nature. Don't let anyone tell you that Smith isn't a little bit of an Aristotelian. He does think there is such a thing as a perfection of human nature. And so because people desire to have compassionate compatriots, they'll oblige others by restraining their own passions, and one who has fully developed these virtues, he says, has achieved that perfection. And so I could take much more time to do justice to Smith, but in short, Smith says, the process of developing those moral sentiments and social virtues is a complex one, where our choices are received and judged by those around us, and we judge their reactions to us, and so on in a sort of like iterative cycle. In this account of sympathy leading to the development of virtue, we see the importance of judgment for Smith. This concept's treated at length in a book that's been very influential on my work by philosopher Samuel Fleischacker. The book is called The Third Concept of Liberty. That refers to, we commonly think of positive and negative liberty. Negative liberty, the freedom to be left alone. Positive liberty, the sort of liberty you get when you're enabled to be free. Fleischacker argues Smith is working with a third kind of liberty he calls independent judgment. So Fleischacker says that a good working definition of judgment is, quote, the conclusion of a train of thought where the interpretation of particular cases is essential to that train of thought, and the practice under whose rules the conclusion is reached allows for further reasonable disagreement over that conclusion. In other words, we come to certain choices, and we submit those choices to the judgments of others who can disagree with the choices that we made, and they can tell us why they disagree with them, and we can revise our own judgments accordingly. So for Smith, the process of sympathetic apprehension of the feelings of others is a starting point. The choices we make on the basis of that are where we move from there. This judgment is not unreflective, it's not random, because it's based on the information we accumulate, and it results in subsequent action. But it's also not algorithmic or calculative, because there can be reasonable disagreement over the outcome and the judgment made. And so the development of our moral sentiments, on Smith's account, requires this kind of moral judgment. Fleischacker says that this third concept of liberty that he sees running through Smith construes freedom above all as that which enables one to judge for one's self, unlike a child, which requires others to judge for her, who requires tutelage. We see this as well in Smith's economic thought. So he somewhat famously says that laws that restrict the liberty of potential employees to submit their skills to the judgment of their employers are unjust. They're manifest violations of liberty because they do not enable this complex refinement of judgment to take place. So by robbing the worker and the employer of the ability to exercise and develop their judgment, these sorts of employment restriction laws that he talks about in Wealth of Nations violate, he says, liberty and justice. They make us less free, both as an external constraint and as a restriction of our capacity to judge. So how does this relate to technology? Amidst Smith's praise for the division of labor, we find an interesting and now relatively famous insight that microscopically subdivided labor can do something to the psyche or the soul of the worker. By repeating one menial task ad nauseum, Smith says, we might get very good at that task, but at the expense of our physical and mental faculties. And the consequences of this specialization are drastic. The worker afflicted with the kind of menial tasks Smith describes is, I would say, a kind of poor creature, all told. He says this type of person is, quote, not only incapable of relishing or bearing any part of rational conversation, but of conceiving of any generous, noble, or tender sentiment, and consequently of forming any just judgment concerning many, even of the ordinary duties of private life, not to mention public life. That is, the economically beneficial advances of technology and the division of labor have, he thinks, occasionally caused harm to the ability of the worker to exercise judgment and to be fully free. But you might think at this point, justifiably, haven't we moved beyond this concern? Very few of us, at least in the developed world, let's not forget about the factories overseas, very few of us are stuck in these sort of rote tasks, just button-pushing, lever-pulling jobs. Hasn't technology, in a way, solved the problem that Smith identifies? And that's an interesting question, one that I think John Stuart Mill helps us answer, but one that I'll return to if I have time in my conclusion. So I want to jump here to Mill very quickly. Mill wrote quite a lot that I think is useful on the topic of technology. One of the interesting psychological quirks of Mill is I think he was constantly plagued with a fear that the Benthamite education his father subjected him to had turned him into a machine. He's quite concerned that he had been turned into this unfeeling, unhuman thing that was not quite human. And he wrote an essay titled On Genius that's a little lesser read than some of his other works. It's a response to another anonymous essay that was published in the Edinburgh Review. And in this essay, as well as his later works, I think he consistently encourages forming the minds of individuals such that they are able not just to repeat facts, know information, accept the word of others on faith, and so on, but are instead equipped to analyze, reason, imagine, and invent as human beings. And so he says that this requires understanding that while formal education is important, it's not exhaustive. It's not even the main thing. He says in On Genius that whatever acts upon the minds of the laboring classes is properly their education. Their minds, like those of other people, are acted upon by the whole of their social circumstances, including the devices that they use. And often the part of their education which is least efficacious as such is that which goes by the name. In other words, we're more educated by the whole of our social circumstances than the time we spend in the classroom. And so Mill is concerned and critical, by contrast, with a world where individuals are trained to think mechanically, as they would through rote reasoning or memorization or through simple mathematical, or he says, algorithmic principles, where they're fully beholden to the decisions of others without the knowledge or understanding necessary for their own free assent to those decisions and to be meaningfully free. Mill actually makes a stark claim in On Liberty to this effect that I find is very interesting. He says, if we could replace all workers with automata, he says, like automatons, that could do their work better than they could, and do it productively, he says, we shouldn't do that, actually. We would be sacrificing something very important about human nature and freedom that choice permits and drives forward. And so this argument, I think, suggests two very important things. One is that we should avoid creating humans that behave like automatons, and second, that we should avoid creating automatons that prevent human beings from developing fully in their capacity as human beings. And I'll conclude by shaking my fist at AI in just a minute. So in On Genius, Mill is responding to this guy who wrote this anonymous essay in the Edinburgh Review, where he's lamenting that there are so few opportunities today for people to exercise genius. There's no room now, his anonymous interlocutor says, for a Newton or a Kepler. We've discovered so many things. How many people can actually go on and be geniuses? And Mill agrees in a sense. Insofar as he says, we need to maintain a distinction between man and machine. We need to distinguish between a person and a pulley, he says, and we need to preserve human happiness. And he makes what I think is a very crucial distinction. He says that we must distinguish between the thing produced in whatever work something is doing and the thing producing it. In other words, he says, we judge human beings not by what they make in the work that they do, but rather by the spirit in which they do it. So a machine, he says, in his time and ours can make things that previously only human beings could make, and it can do it quite well and beautifully. But being able to produce nice things doesn't make the machine a human, and vice versa. The human being doing a menial task doesn't somehow become less than human. He says we need to find some way to preserve what he calls the higher endowments of humanity. So Mill says, human beings are fit with certain capacities by nature to create good works, to be happy, and we can't judge them by the products of their work. A person doing trivial work is not less valuable as a human being. A machine does not become human by virtue of its products. Where Mill's interlocutor goes wrong, he says, is in believing that we only exercise the human capacity for genius when we come up with something entirely new. He says, actually, the faculty of genius is this amazing thing that human beings have where we get to apprehend, comprehend, and understand for ourselves in a way that's new to us. So exercising genius, he says, doesn't mean being a Newton and coming up with mathematical principles no one has thought of before. It means that you are using your faculties as a human being to understand things that you didn't understand before. Genius, he says, is a power of the mind to operate in a certain way that is characteristic of a free human pursuing free thought. And so the spirit of work that he describes is that spirit of free and original understanding, not new discovery. And this influences his view of education. He says, education then, that is historically in what he calls the classical mode or ancient mode, consisted not in giving what is called knowledge, that is, grinding down other men's ideas to convenient size and then cramming it into people's brains. It was a series of exercises to form the thinking faculty itself, that the mind, being active and vigorous, might go forth and know. In contrast, Mill says, modern education is all cram. Latin cram, mathematical cram, literary cram, political cram, cramming facts into people's brain. The world already knows everything and has only to tell our children, who on their part only have to hear and parrot it and lay it to rote. That is, he says, not to heart. The remedy he proposes for the decline of genius is a rethinking of the purpose of education itself, to fit the mind for learning from its own consciousness and observation. That human beings have occasion to exercise that power under ever-varying circumstances, which no routine or rule of thumb or algorithm can make provision. Mill's discussion of education, I think, across his work, presents this kind of egalitarian, relatively optimistic view of the ability of society, if it rethinks the purpose of education, to equip even its least well-off members to be independent and free from paternalistic care or mechanical, pre-decided patterns of thought. So, I want to conclude by giving you the sort of application section, the way I think that this is relevant or useful for our present dilemmas. Together, I think, Smith and Mill value a kind of intellectual independence or freedom. One of the beefs, I guess, I have with Samuel Fleischacker is that I don't think this independence he describes is a Kantian autonomous independence. Instead, it's a carefully cultivated capacity for judgment that we make in social environments that are subject to revision and accountability. When we are subject to the decisions of others, when our decisions are substituted for the decision someone else has made, when we're prevented from making our own decisions and submitting them to the judgment of others. I think Smith and Mill say we are deprived of an opportunity to develop in our capacity as human beings towards what Smith calls the perfection of human nature, or what Mill is thinking of as these characteristic human faculties. So together, I think they tell us we should be concerned with those things that threaten our capacity to develop judgment or to exercise it in meaningful choices of our own. Let me offer as an example a recent phenomenon that's easily observable on Twitter, or X, I guess, but I don't call it that. Someone makes a claim, a contestable claim, a fact about history, a book they've read, politics, or something, and someone seeking to dispute their claim might, instead of researching the topic themselves, instead of coming to their own conclusions, making their own reasoned judgments, they might say, at Grok, is this true? And invoke Twitter's proprietary AI to answer the question for them. At this point, the proprietary AI will respond in the conversation and provide what is supposedly an authoritative voice. These people have offloaded their judgments onto the judgments of a machine. And this, I would suggest, is precisely the kind of mental offloading we should fear. To the extent that our conversation partners in these discussions have transmitted their judgment onto a machine and simply accepted its output, they are undermining their capacity for and the exercise of a meaningful kind of freedom. Think, too, of what I have elsewhere mournfully called an AI crisis in higher education. When I provide feedback on a student paper, I do so with an eye toward improving the student's writing. Right? My goal is to provide my reasoned judgment as hopefully sometimes a subject matter expert, depends on the class I'm teaching, I suppose, on the quality of their writing, their evidence and their argument. And they, in turn, hopefully can take my judgment into account when making all of the complex choices that take place when researching and writing a paper. If the paper I am grading has been made by a machine instead of my student, my judgments aren't relevant to the student, except insofar as they hope to develop better techniques to trick me in the future. Their development as a writer, a scholar, and a human being has been stunted when they offload their judgment to the machine, and my work as an educator and a grader has been wasted. I borrow from my my graduate advisor, Richard Averminko, a section of my syllabus where I tell students that I consider cheating an insult, and in a world where I can no longer duel you over insults, I will do the next best thing, which is I will tell on you. So, my fear, then, is that our new technologies, even more than the technologies that Smith and Mill are describing in their own sort of slightly pre-industrial or industrial era, cut off our development of our faculties or stunt them and narrow the scope of their exercise. Tocqueville has this famous section where he talks about the type of despotism democratic people have to fear. And he says it's not the tyrants of old, right? It's not the Caesars and the old school kind of tyrants. Instead, the democratic despot is a schoolmaster-like despot who makes decisions for you. And over time, with your assent, narrows the field of the operation and exercise of your free will, he calls it, into smaller and smaller domains until all you're making choices about are your petty pleasures, not the important duties of public and private life that Mill describes. Our democratic despots today may well be business people as well as bureaucrats, algorithms as well as authoritarians. So let me conclude with this, as I'm coming up on time. When Smith observes the character of those who are mentally mutilated by their narrow work, he says they're not only incapable of relishing or bearing any part of rational conversation, but of conceiving any generous, noble, or tender sentiment, and consequently of forming any just judgment concerning many even of the ordinary duties of private life. That is, even in their homes, they're not fun people to be around and they can't make good choices, not to mention their public life. If such a person is incapable of forming just judgments about their private duties, how much more will they be incapable of forming just judgments about public life where self-interest may need to take a back seat to higher goods of citizenship? And so a world where people are formed in this way, I think, would be a world with poor examples of human beings and poor citizens. And to the extent that our new technologies are creating such people through our dependence on them, through our reliance on them, through our offloading of our faculty for judgment on them, I think we would be wise not to find ourselves among those sorts of people. So thank you. I look forward to your questions.
If you could please raise your hand, Dr. Bunn will call on you.
One of my pet peeves is Google Maps, okay? Yes. And but I've been thinking about what you had to say. And the first thing is that I think Google Maps can be, and I'm using that as a substitute for AI or, technology. It's something that we can all relate to. I think it's how we approach it. Are we using it to allow us to free up our minds so while we're driving we can do other more broad things? Or are we narrowing our judgments and just doing what it tells us to do? So I think ultimately it's not the tool that's the problem, it's the person. And is that what you're saying here, is that it's the person being created or developed because they have too much access to these tools?
Yeah, Maps is a really good example of this. It's really dangerous when you're doing the kind of work that I do, where you're trying to draw sort of normative conclusions from the history of political thought, to look for scientific justifications for the things you're saying, but I try to do it sometimes anyways. And there's a really interesting study on people who rely on turn-by-turn navigation versus who don't, who either sort of know where they're going and don't rely on it, or use more old-fashioned ways of navigating. And there's actually observable degradation in your sort of perceptual reasoning over time. So there's like neuroscientific studies that suggest, at least, that you are degrading some faculty of spatial reasoning to the extent that you fully offload your spatial reasoning onto a turn-by-turn navigation software. And so I think that's an interesting example of what I would say is, I think, the answer to the large part of your question, which is, I think what I'm concerned with in new technologies is the tendencies that are sort of baked into them. So I encourage my students, they don't always end up agreeing with me, it's fine, but I encourage them to break out of this mentality that many of us have, that technologies are neutral, so-called, instead to think that these things have sort of incentives baked into them, right? We could even adopt a sort of like public choice method of reasoning here and say there are ways we would expect people to behave with these devices in hand, and we can understand why they do so. We don't have to think they're bad people for using them the way they're designed, and those uses drive them toward certain habits of mind and character that often I think are detrimental. So while I wouldn't class out the idea that there are useful and helpful and virtuous ways to use some of these technologies, I think what we see on the whole, especially with AI right now, is that of course we can understand that students equipped with an easy plagiarism bot are going to use it, right? Like that, of course we can understand why they do that, and we can understand the long-term consequences of offloading all of their intellectual capacity onto it. So well, I think you're right to suggest there is a sort of agential element here, that like we give people sort of responsibility for the tools and the way they use them. But there's also a sort of resigned pessimism on my part, which is I know how most people are going to use these things, and I think it's going to be in ways that are ultimately detrimental to us. So yeah, I hope that answers your question. Yeah.
Hi, you're at Covenant College, right?
Yes, I am.
Cool. So I'm thinking about what Pope Leo XIV is doing with AI, and like in the Protestant space, like in the PCA in particular. Like, are you the only person who's doing this? And like, how can you use the Westminster Confession of Faith and the Protestant intellectual infrastructure to do sort of a Protestant social teaching?
No, so it would be very arrogant of me to say I'm the only person doing this. I think there's some really interesting work that's come out of places like Acton Institute that are doing work in Protestant social thought, and so people associated with Acton and other organizations have started this Future for the Family project that I think is pushing towards some of the things that I'm harping on. But I think you're right. It's interesting that our new Pope has offered some commentary on this, suggesting that like what Pope Leo XIII did for social thought in terms of labor, he might want to advance in terms of social thought, in terms of technology. I think that's good. I respect that as a Protestant. That's good. I think to the question of the confessional standards and what it might say, I think any good commentary on technology and what it does to us as human beings has to be grounded in a good understanding of what human beings are and are for. And so in our use of technology or our criticism of technology, I think you're going to have to start with the sort of question one of the catechism sort of thing that we're made to glorify God and enjoy Him forever. And I think many of these tools harm us in our journey to do that. So I would gladly unite with anybody who's sort of on the same page about that. Yeah. I don't know if that fully answers your question, but I think there are people doing good work on it. I hope the conversation continues and more people start talking about it. So.
Yeah, thanks. If I may add one.
Yeah.
It's because like there's something about man stealing in the larger catechism, the WLC larger catechism, but like no, I haven't seen much. If any, I think Anthony Bradley might have done something on this, but there's not a lot of social thought in the PCA rooted in the catechism. I think using that language to extrapolate it the way the Catholics do, and that's something that I would love to see. If is citing the standards as the reason for your intellectual work.
Sure. So are you like man stealing in the sense of like thinking of like a plagiarism bot sort of stealing from human beings, or can you?
No, it was man stealing associated with slavery in the Eighth Commandment. I think exposition. Yeah. Like.
So I may not be fully understanding, but I would love to see more of that. So if I could be a part of that, or if other people are doing that, would be great. So thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
This is a little off the
Close.
This is a little off the path, but there seems like there's somewhat missing to me is like you don't bring in the emotional side of human nature or the intelligent side of human nature. And some of the stuff wouldn't it be, would you inject pride, or if you take some people are just sort of dull and that's they're fine with some sort of manual thing, that they're just doing something repetitive and they don't really put much thought into it. How do you, would that add more to what you're trying to come across, I guess?
Yeah, I think Mill's really good for this in a sense I didn't have time to really bring out, but one of the things that he says in an essay that he wrote that's a book review of a book called The Claims of Labor is that his project of whatever sort of progressive reform he's aiming for, I'm not necessarily signing on to everything that Mill wanted policy-wise, but what he's aiming for, he says, is not a system where we elevate people out of the working class. It's where we elevate the status of the working class. So it's think better of them and the work that they're doing. And so I don't mean to suggest that all work of a certain class or status is like fundamentally degrading. And I think Mill is really good for this to say, like, no, there are people who are always going to be doing that work. And if they do it as human beings, there's something really lovely about that. And this goes for Smith as well. He says, yeah, you're going to have people doing work that he's concerned might mentally mutilate them. And so one of the things he suggests is we need some sort of program of education that equips even those lowest status people in these menial jobs with the intellectual resources to be as full and flourishing human beings as they can be in whatever work they find themselves. So I think you're right. Like there's an important thing here, which is like not to suggest that all work of a certain type is fundamentally undignified. I don't think that's true. And on the emotional side as well, I think Smith is very good on this, although he writes like somebody who's never felt an emotion. He writes about emotions mostly. And he, I think, is suggesting that our judgments matter in our refinement of our ability to feel things the way we ought. He's kind of like, I think, a soft Aristotelian in this way, that there are ways that you ought to feel as a good, virtuous human being. And his fear, I think, is that when we stunt people's capacity to judge, we're limiting them in both their professional, political, and emotional choices. So I hope that kind of gets at what you're saying. So I think you're right. Like these are things that are woven through these thinkers that I'm working with. It's just things I didn't have a chance to talk about today. Yeah, if that's helpful.
Thank you very much, Doctor. my question has to do with the paradox that we potentially face now and in the future. Specifically, what I'm speaking to is your talk focused on the individual and the degradation of the human, as it were, by using certain tools or relying upon the machine too much. Would that be fair?
Yes.
But what if the use of these tools, and specifically the AI revolution that we're on the crest of, leads to greater human flourishing worldwide, and from a societal standpoint, there's great benefit to it?
Yeah.
Is that an acceptable trade-off, to take that at the degradation of the individual human?
Yeah, that's a very good question, I think, and it's tied to the thing I brought up early on, which is I think the natural response that I've gotten most in doing this project is people say, hasn't sort of technology solved the problems of technology that you're identifying? We've freed people from these previously degrading tasks or what have you. And so what amount of good might sort of trade off for the negatives that I'm describing? I'm a kind of pessimist in a way, but I try to be so without refusing to acknowledge the goods of technology. So when you look at graphs of infant mortality and starvation and abject poverty, these plummeting, these sort of hockey stick graphs are wonderful things, I think, and they are directly due to, I think, productive advances of technology that you're describing. And so what I would just say is, in line with people like Smith and Tocqueville and Mill, we need to be, I guess, open-eyed advocates of these things. If we want to praise them, we need to say, like, there are wonderful things about them. Like, Smith is, I think, very positive about what he calls commercial society and the goods that it brings. He's like, it used to be that societies did, or at least thought themselves essential to let old and young and sick people starve to death, and we don't do that anymore because we have these productive advances. Isn't that good? But also here are the fears or the concerns that come along with it. And it's not that he thinks our new society is a particularly fraught moral situation. It's just that if we want the best version of it that we could have, we need to be open-eyed about the negatives as well and try to address those. So if I'm taking you correctly, I think the proper answer is not to be a sort of like Ted Kaczynski kind of burn it all down pessimist. It's to say those goods are real and they exist and we need to acknowledge them. But we also need to acknowledge, especially like as an educator right now, the AI stuff is what I'm sort of shaking my fist at. Like it's been horrific to what it's done to our students and their intellectual capacity, and the long-term consequences of that I think we're only just sort of seeing the glimmers of. So it scares me a lot, but I don't want to be so scared that I'm unwilling to acknowledge the positives that you're describing. Is that helpful? Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much for this talk. So I really like Adam Smith, and I think he's right about a lot of the things he said. But that comment about kind of the repetitive factory work, where he says, he worries that a person's mind will become more as stupid as it can possibly be, or something along those lines. I've always found that to be like a really out of touch line. That this comes from someone who only could not have done this himself. Yeah. So I've worked here for 14 years. It's a great institution. I'm very blessed to be able to write and speak and edit and all of that. But before that, I had a very blue-collar work experience, working at factories. I was a janitor, that kind of thing. And a year before I started seminary, I worked at a factory, and kind of begrudgingly so. I really wanted to start seminary, but I had to take this year off to work. And what I discovered once I got over myself was that the more repetitive the work I was doing, the freer my mind was. I could pray. I could recite the Psalms. I could sing hymns. And I could talk with my coworkers. And it turns out my coworkers were actually pretty sharp people. Our quality assurance guy let me borrow his copy of the Book of Enoch, and we discussed that. One of our techs was really into mysticism, so we talked about asceticism. And there's a fellow operator who was Buddhist and had very strong opinions about the superiority of Buddhism over Christianity. And you get all these great conversations on the factory floor that I think, an outsider just saying, oh, it's such repetitive work. And by the way, I was working not only with machines, but actual robots, making, these really high standard medical devices here in town. I didn't see it as a barrier at all. In fact, working here, as much as I love my job, when I'm reading and I'm editing, my mind is not free to pray the whole time. It's a struggle, right, to maintain that sort of inner discipline. So I guess, to piggyback on what a lot of other people have already said, I think if you say, well, ultimately it comes down to how the person in this role has been shaped by education and culture, haven't you ruled out technology as a cause? Right? Isn't it then, therefore, education and culture? And to maybe sharpen this a little bit, your students using AI. The problem is not AI, it's the past teachers they've had that have not taught them how to think. It is a magnifying glass showing you the result of their education and culture, just like the machine can be a magnifying glass showing you the result of education and culture, but not a cause. How would you respond to that?
Yeah, so a couple things. That's very helpful. I think one caveat I would want to have is that I want to be careful about analogizing from our sort of modern working environments to what Smith is describing. Smith, in some ways, he's been criticized for failing to foresee sort of industrial work in its flourishing. He doesn't seem to talk much about the kinds of factories we associate mentally with kind of like Dickensian industrial era, and so he may have missed some things there. But also the kind of work that he's describing, in many ways, I think would be worse than some of us expect in terms of labor hours and the things that were required and remuneration and all this stuff. So it could be that the work that he's envisioning is just worse than what I've also done. Relatively repetitive, rote blue collar stuff. So like I share, I think, what you're saying, which is like I experienced this as a rather good thing. I enjoyed the work that I did. I listened to podcasts, all sorts of stuff. So that's one thing, is the work may have been different. The second thing is that the sort of habits of mind and socialization you're describing in the midst of that kind of work, that the work itself is not particularly fulfilling, but as you said, the more you repeat it, it frees your mind for other things. That does, I think, require a kind of preparation for that enables you to do that. And that's what Smith gets at, I think, in his section on public education, where he says, well, if we're going to live in this world where people are doing this kind of work, what we would need to make sure is that before that, they at least have sufficient preparation to where their minds could be freed by this. And that's so I think there are optimistic prospects there, but it requires a kind of framework or scaffolding beforehand for it to actually be useful. I love that you're saying, like prayer and these habits of mind and character that you have. I think, that assumes in the background that you've had some sort of religious formation and education that would fit you for that. I on the question of like AI not being the problem, I am sympathetic to that. But I also think it is the problem. So it's you're correct that there's a sense in which the past teachers these students have had may be at fault for not teaching them to think correctly or think correctly about their own education. But also at the same time, going back to this first question, I just can understand why when I give a student a plagiarism bot and I know how students are and they're tired and they're overworked and they're stressed and I don't really care about this class or this assignment, I'm just going to use the plagiarism bot, right? So I can take a perfectly well-prepared student and give them easy, undetectable avenues for cheating and completely understand why they would cheat. So I think that you're correct that there's background stuff that we need to care about, but also the tool itself introduces new incentives and new habits of mind and character that I think we can attribute to the tool itself in many ways. So I would push back, I guess, on that, but thank you. It's helpful.
Hi, Professor. Thank you for your presentation today. I really appreciate it. It's very helpful. Just one question or observation. It seems to me that our society is atomized from the Trinitarian communities that existed in the pre-industrial age. AI shows the lack of these qualitative fields of communities. So I'm just wondering if, it seems like the community, AI just kind of emphasizes the lack thereof of the qualitative Trinitarian communities that you can think of, for example, during the Reformation, Renaissance period. Thank you.
There's an interesting survey that was done at like year intervals. So the first survey they did was like shortly after the public release of ChatGPT. The most recent one came out 6 months or so now, and you look at the way that people self-describe the way they use these AI tools. And originally, a lot of people were saying, "Oh, I use it like a search engine. I use it for information, etc." But now, the most recent survey, most people are self-reporting that they use it for companionship or therapy. That's the top use. And so I think you're right to hone in on the sort of communal element of this, that it's kind of exposing a lack that we feel. And so also back to this last question, it certainly exacerbates some background vices, right? If you've not been taught to think well about what education is for, you're obviously going to be more likely to use these tools in bad ways. If you don't have a thick community around you that has encouraged you towards what I would call virtuous habits of mind and character, I can see why that would fit you for using this in more negative ways. So I think you're right to hone in on, like, there are background conditions that make this even worse, and that's part of why it scares me so much. Is like, we were already dealing with all of these awful things. I started this project before ChatGPT came out, and I just feel more and more right as time goes on. So it's been interesting to say, oh, all this stuff I was already working on, now that we have this tool, seems even more correct. I've just been right all along, and now I'm just more right. Yeah. But thank you. That's helpful. I appreciate it. Got a couple in the bag. It's hard for me to see. Sorry.
Is there a possibility that we are going to be doing things in a regressive-like manner, such as using blue books in the classroom? For those of us who remember having to write it all and do it right on the spot, you can't use AI.
Yeah. Yes. I also feel like I've been right all along, because I've been using Blue Books since the day I got to grad school. Like, all of my classes have always been handwritten, because I just assumed they would cheat all the time anyways before these tools existed. So that's, I feel ahead of the curve there. But one of the things that I've been thinking about a lot lately, and I've written a little bit on this, is that I think you're right that Blue Books solve a kind of problem, and it's really useful to be able to say, okay, you're going to sit down in a room with your brain and a blank sheet of paper in front of you, and you're going to tell me what you've learned, and I will know something after you're done about did you do the reading and what did you comprehend, etc. That's not a clean substitute for some of the other assignments that we do, though. So like a research paper is a different set of skills. It has different goals, and so I don't want to forsake those. I still assign them because I think they serve a goal. When I assign them, I just assume that most students are going to cheat on them. So I think the way I would put it is, like, Blue Books are great. They're helpful, but they're not a clean substitute or solution for all the things that we're losing at the hands of AI. One thing that I can't prove this, so this is sort of speculation, but I did have a class. I had about 45, 50 students who were all doing a Blue Book exam, but there were a set of 10 or 12 students. It was an exam that had a study guide, and they did the handwritten exams, but 10 or 12 of them made a similar weird mistake. And I couldn't help but think they went and put my study guide into ChatGPT and then memorized its output so that they could go write it down by hand later. So I can't prove that, but I do fear as well that the students who have a habit of using this for everything are using it to prepare for even handwritten exams in ways that are still going to be sort of intellectually detrimental. So yeah, I would love more professors to do more in-class stuff, more handwritten stuff, 100%. It's just not a clean substitute for all of the stuff that I want to assign, and so I'm still going to be lamenting its loss, yeah. There's somebody.
Have you ever heard of Joseph Chilton Pearce? He did research on the human brain, and he said that the head is intellect and it's more male. The heart is more intelligence, it's the female, and we need both. So I'm kind of a both-and person with everything. And I said, after the gift of life, the greatest gift God gave us is the gift of choice.
Yeah, I'm not familiar, so I'd have to look into it. But I think the head and the heart approach, I think, is very helpful. This is one reason, again, why I love Smith, is I think he unites these things very well. It's not all just rationality and reasoning, and he's very concerned with our sentiments, our passions, our feelings, bringing those in and suggesting, I think, in line with a pretty great tradition, that there are ways that you ought to feel as a virtuous human being. And so I think he's very useful for that. So no, I'm not familiar, but I'll
right. Well, check him out. I said I love the men in my life, but I think that a lot of the problems that are caused, a lot of them, the imbalance between male and female energies, the wars that we're having, the devastation, the suffering of children. There is so much going on. There's more good going on in the world, but it's beneath the big headlines. The big headlines, all the drama. So I love what you're doing. Keep doing it. I just feel so honored to have heard your talk today.
Well, thank you for coming. I appreciate it.
I just have a question in regards to the scope of information that is coming in on any one person. We're all expected to have opinions on everything from Gaza to, natural disasters to policy. Is there a way in which the amount of information is already overriding some of our sentiments and our sympathies in such a way that it is difficult to even focus on our community and our local people that we know, and kind of make us feel incompetent to address some of the larger issues that we would, theoretically be best suited to address?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. The concept of the Ordo Amoris made some headlines a few months ago when Vice President Vance used it in context not everybody agreed with. But Smith has an interesting example, a kind of famous one. It's like the Chinese earthquake analogy that he uses, where he says in TMS that if you told a man that there was like some great earthquake in China and tons of people died, he would be more concerned if you told him that tomorrow you're going to chop his little finger off, right? You're going to care more about the thing that's closest to you, just sort of how our affections work. And I think there's a weird distorting effects when we have this sort of open flow access to information where we are kind of expected to know about, have opinions about, and feel about things at a great distance constantly in a variety of situations. And so, I don't really know what the solution is. I think new technologies obviously exacerbate this, but it's just it's all just kind of distressing to me. So that's not a good answer to your question. It's just I think you're correct that there's the information overload is a significant part of this, and I don't know what the answer is. So yeah.
We have time for one more question.
Thank you so much for your talk. I just wanted to touch one more time on education. You mentioned how the classical view is that education's not just about knowledge. It's about acquiring, I can't remember what you said, skills or thinking capacity or whatever. So I guess, and I'm an educator myself, like positively, like what can education help with? I mean, there's things as simple as like, spelling and grammar check, book summaries, all sorts of things. And I guess, what is your just thought on just what is the purpose of education and how can AI be, we've talked about detrimental like cheating, but is there any way it can be positive or assisting in research, thinking, just anything?
Yeah, I mean, I think what the classical view that, again, this might be controversial in some circles, but I think Mill is driving towards, is that education is made to fit people to think and feel and behave as they ought. So it's preparing them with the tools and skills necessary for that. He sees what he calls a cram kind of education as skipping that entirely. It's not that he's opposed to memorization. He was a very brilliant guy. He memorized lots of stuff. It's that when your education is all just like, let me see how much stuff you memorized off the sheet, you're skipping a step that's quite essential. And so, yeah, I would say my goal in education, the way I tell my students sometimes, I'm like, hey, I'm going to give you a kind of peek behind the curtain. The way I design my class is I want you to sort of like read the stuff that I've assigned 3 times functionally. Once before class, once like while we're in class discussing it together, and then again as you go and do your assignments. And that kind of habitual reading teaches them to sort of be steeped in a text, to learn what the author is arguing, and to then communicate to someone else what they've understood from the text. And so those are my primary concern usually is not like how much raw information did you gather from this text. It's the skills that accompany that process of iterative reading and writing and research. So I think that's what I would say is a good education is going to form someone with those habits of mind and character that are going to send them out into the world and be able, the cliche is like we're not teaching you what to think, we're teaching you how to think. And that's not entirely true because we do want to teach students what to think sometimes. There are right answers to some questions. But there's an intuition about that is right. That is like we're giving you the skills and equipment to do this education. We talk about making lifelong learners and things like this. That's I think a good goal, as cliche as it sounds. So I don't know if that fully answers your question, but that's the direction I would aim at. Yeah.
Thank you, Philip.